Hi everybody, this is Professor Quine. I was reviewing the webinars on my YouTube channel and I saw that I have a webinar on compound sentences. Then I have I also have a webinar on compound complex sentences. In the compound complex sentence webinar, I briefly review compound sentences and complex sentences, but I devote the webinar to compound complex sentences, which only makes sense, right? But what I realized was I needed a webinar just about complex sentences, okay? So that's what this webinar is going to be all about. So to get us started, I'm going to show you the difference quickly between a compound sentence, a complex sentence, and a compound complex sentence, and then dedicate the rest of this webinar, which will be pretty short, to the complex sentence. Okay, so you know that a compound sentence follows the equation independent clause plus independent clause, right? So you could have a method. There are two types that I teach, method 1 and method 2. Method 1 is that comma and a fan voice. So we could have something along the lines of, okay, so Bill is tall, but Tom is short. Okay, comma, but would be the fanboy used here. So that's the way you would do a method 1. The method 2 version of that would be, right? Because with method 2, you're using a semicolon, a conjunctive adverb, and a comma. Okay, so that's an example, 2 examples of compound sentences, method 1 and a method 2. So if you need to know more, see me do a little bit more compound sentences, go back and watch that webinar on my YouTube channel. Okay, so that's compound sentence. So let's go to complex sentence. A complex sentence follows either a dependent clause plus independent clause equation or independent clause plus dependent clause equation, okay? So we're going to, talk a bit about that in this webinar, but basically what we're referring to is something that will look like this. Okay, so because I am tired, I did not stay up and watch television. So because I am tired would be the dependent clause. I did not stay up and watch television as the independent clause. And then this is the same, idea in the sentence, but this is with the independent clause. Here it is. The independent clause first and the dependent clause at the end, okay? So that's the 2 versions of the complex sentence. Now, a compound complex sentence follows one of these equations, dependent clause plus independent clause plus independent clause, because remember, part of this is a compound sentence, right? Look at the compound sentence equation. And then to have a complex sentence, you have to have a dependent clause. So here we're squishing all of it together, right? Dependent clause plus independent clause plus independent clause, or independent clause plus independent clause plus dependent clause. Okay, so those are kind of complicated, more complicated sentences. Certainly doable. You'll have no trouble with it, I don't think, understanding it. But, you have to follow the system here of understanding the compound sentence, understanding the complex sentence, and then understanding, it helps you to understand the compound complex sentence, right? So I have this webinar on my YouTube channel, the one dedicated compound complex sentences. I have this webinar on my YouTube channel, the compound sentence, okay? But what I don't have is one just about complex sentences. So that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today, okay? So what is a complex sentence? Well, as you see, a complex sentence is a sentence that has a dependent clause plus an independent clause. In some of them, the dependent clause comes first. In some of them, the dependent clause comes last. I will tell you that the one that is more common is this one. This is the one that the very first one, the dependent clause in the front, that's the one that works the most often. But you do see these other types too. This one uses a comma to separate the dependent clause from the independent clause. An example is this one right here. You see how it uses this comma right here to separate the dependent clause from the independent clause. What makes this a dependent clause? Well, when I put the word because in front of I am tired, I basically create a fragment. If I walk up to you and say, because I am tired, you would say, what happened? I don't understand. That's not a complete thought, is it? Well, that's why I need to attach this dependent clause to an independent clause to finish the thought. So when you say, well, what happened because you were tired? Well, when I attach this independent clause, I did not stay up and watch television. Now you understand what happened because I am tired, okay? Because I am tired, you know, today I can't stay up and watch television. I didn't stay up, all right? All right, so you can also create some of these with the dependent clause in the back, like this, okay? But when you do that, what happened to it? It went away. Wait a minute. Oh, I see. I copied the wrong thing. There. Now, I put the dependent clause in the back, right? So I don't have a comma here, right? When you put the dependent clause behind the independent clause, you do not use a comma. But when you put, that's what happened. I put two of them here. When you put the dependent clause in front of the independent clause, you do use a comma, all right? Okay, so let's try a few. Let's get this out of the way and see how you do with this. Here's an independent clause. And here's another one. Okay, so if I walk up to you and I say, I was sick, that stands on its own. It's got a subject and verb. It forms a complete thought. That's an independent clause. Same thing is true of this independent clause. I did not go to work yesterday. If I walked up to you and I said that, you get the message. It's an independent clause because it has a subject and a verb. It stands on its own. It forms a complete thought. Now, what if I put a word called a subordinate, or better yet, adverb clause subordinator? Words like although, since, while, because, those kinds of words, and there are several others, are called adverb clause subordinators. You see, an adverb clause is the most common type of dependent clause. Not the only type of dependent clause, but the adverb clause is the most common type of dependent clause. So what if I put the word because in front of this independent clause, I was sick? Now, if I walk up to you and I say, because I was sick, is that a complete thought anymore? No. It changes everything, right? Remember, before I put the word because here, it was an independent clause. I was sick. You got it, right? You understood what I was saying. But put that adverb clause subordinator in front of there, and guess what? I've made a fragment out of this, okay? So what would help to defragmentize this, this construction here, this because I was sick? Well, if I hooked it on to this other clause, this independent clause, I did not go to work yesterday. So now I have a complete thought. Because I was sick, what happened? I did not go to work yesterday. So I have now a dependent clause hooked on to an independent clause. So in other words, I have a complex sentence. And remember, when you put the dependent clause in front of the independent clause, you use a comma, okay? Now, what happens if I put the dependent clause behind the independent clause? Here's where the dependent clause is now. You see it? So here's the independent clause. And here's the dependent clause. Okay, so what happens? Well, guess what? I don't use the comma. So do you see how I use the comma up here? I don't use it down here. It's all about the placement of the dependent clause. All right, so let me give you a couple of independent clauses. You try it on your own. I'm just going to stop talking. You can go ahead and pause the webinar. Try working it out on your own, okay, as a complex sentence, putting the two clauses together. And see, well, I'll come back on and you can tell you what the answer would be. So here's an independent clause, and here's another independent clause. So let's say, okay, so I have two independent clauses. One says, I washed the laundry. The other says, you washed the car. So what I want you to do, here's the directions. Create two complex sentences. The first should be a dependent clause plus independent clause complex sentence using the adverb clause subordinator while. Okay, the second complex sentence will be an independent clause. It'll follow this equation. Independent clause plus dependent clause using the adverb. Whoops, what happened? There we go. Adverb clause subordinator while. Okay, so both of the complex sentences that you create out of these two independent clauses will use the adverb clause subordinator while. But one of the complex sentences will have the dependent clause before the independent clause. The other will have it afterward. Make sure you punctuate correctly, all right? So what you have to do is to look at these two independent clauses, decide which one you're going to put the word while in front of, okay, to make it a dependent clause. So go ahead and give it a shot. Try creating these sentences, and then just pause the webinar. I'm going to take a break here, and then I'll come back online. And once you restart the webinar, you'll hear what the answers are. Go ahead and do your work. Okay, so let's go over the answers. Okay, so the dependent clause plus independent clause complex sentence should look like this. The one that you created should look like this. We're using while, right? While I wash the laundry, you wash the car. Or you could have said, while you wash the car, I wash the laundry. But that's the way I always do it. Is I look to see if I could do make the first one into the dependent clause. That's just the way I chose to do it. Notice that I use the comma right there. So this is the dependent clause. This is the independent clause, right? Okay, so flipping it around, if I'm going to do independent clause plus dependent clause, it would look like this. There's actually a couple ways you could do that. Let's see. But just to make it easy. Okay, so that's the way I chose to do it. I have the dependent clause at the end, independent clause up here, and no comma there. Okay? All right, let's try one more. Let's follow the same method. I'm going to put the independent clauses up on the screen. And then you're going to pause the webinar, make one that has a dependent clause in the front, do the other one with the do another one, the dependent clause in the back, then start the webinar back up, and we'll talk about the answers. So let's try this. Let's say that this independent clause is something along the lines of, I have gotten older. Okay, so there's 2 independent clauses, right? All right, so what I want you to do is to follow basically these directions with a noticeable difference. I want you to create 2 complex sentences, but now what I want you to do is to use the adverb clause subordinator since. So you want to decide which one of these you're going to put the adverb clause subordinator since in front of. Then you're going to create a complex sentence that has a dependent clause in the front. Then you're going to do it again, but with a dependent clause in the back. All right, go ahead and pause the webinar and then start it back up when you're ready and you'll hear the answer, okay? Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So for the one that should have the dependent clause in the front, I would say something along these lines. Since I have gotten older, I do not sleep well. Okay. So I put since in front of I have gotten older, made that into a dependent clause, put a comma between that and the independent clause. Now for the other way around, there you go. The dependent clause is at the back, independent clause is in the front. Okay, and notice that there's no comma with this because I have the dependent clause in the back. When I have the dependent clause in the front, I use the comma. All right, I hope that you found this helpful, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.